Welcome to Jen's new song. I'm excited to have Esther Smith with us here today. She's going to be talking about her book on chronic illness, and I'm very happy to welcome her to the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I am excited to be here and excited to talk about this topic that means a lot to me.
Good. So, why don't you start off telling us a little bit about you, about your story?
Sure. So my name is Esther. I live in Baltimore with my husband and with our two dogs. And I guess I'll just share kind of my story along the lines of my chronic illness story, since that's what we're talking about. Um, so I I've been dealing with health problems for quite some time. They kind of started in childhood, where I just kind of had symptoms off and on throughout my childhood and into high school. But I would say for the most part, um, just my life in general was pretty uneventful before college. It was pretty a good childhood, good high school years, um, and a good experience at college. And then after college, I got married. And about 5 months after I got married, my husband was deployed. So it was kind of during that time when he got deployed that I started having some health problems. And it was kind of like, is this stress? Is this just stress that's going on? Because it's very stressful that my husband is deployed. Is something more going on? I definitely felt like something more was going on, but there was always this kind of thing in the back of my head where it was like, maybe I'm just really stressed. So when he came back, there was this part of me that was really hoping like maybe all of this will go away once he comes back. And that unfortunately did not happen. He came back and I just still was experiencing a lot of health problems. Kind of in the middle of that, we moved from Pittsburgh area where I used to live to Baltimore area where I live now. And still just continue to experience just a lot of different symptoms. And they were just very different at different times. And so over time, some of those symptoms started to decrease, and I felt like I started to get a handle on them. Just like over time, they just kind of seemed to get a little bit better. But kind of what happened next was I was actually injured by a chiropractor. So I went to a chiropractor for some just upper back tension. And they also adjusted my lower back. And so just one time they made a mistake and they kind of just really tweaked my back. And it was sort of this sort of thing where I thought it would quickly just go away. So I just kind of went about my normal life thinking and hoping that it was going to go away. But it's unfortunately not what happened. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Just as I continued to live my life normally, things would just aggravate it and trigger it until it just became very severe and a very huge problem. So all that to say, I was dealing with that and finally received some answers for everything that was going on. Probably, I can't even remember the time frame. It might have been like 2 years ago. I remember it was January. And I finally just made it to the right doctor, who diagnosed me with lupus and hypermobility syndrome. So that's kind of where I started to get some answers to what was going on, but still off and on just couldn't really get a hold of my symptoms. So just seasons of time where I would really be forced to spend most of the time at home, like very difficult for me to get out, just severe levels of pain. And seasons when it would get a little bit better and I would have better months and better weeks, but just ongoing problems. And I feel like for anybody with chronic illness, and for myself included, it's kind of this ongoing story. It's like continuing on to this day. Like even in the last couple of months, I've just had new symptoms in my neck, and just this week I'm having problems in my wrist from typing. So new things just keep coming up, and the story is kind of ongoing. But those are kind of the details of that, of just the specifics of what happened with living with chronic illness. And just there's a lot more to it in terms of just the emotional side of it and how I dealt with it spiritually. And, those are huge parts of that story, with a lot of ups and downs as well. which, you know, a lot of that comes out in the devotional that I wrote, you know, even if I'm not sharing specifically, you know, this is what it was like for me, you know, that's all coming out of my story and kind of how I wrestled with and grappled with, you know, just the emotional side of things and just my faith throughout all of it. So if I kind of had to put it all in a nutshell, I would say that's kind of how things have gone over the last, I guess it's been about 8 years now that I've kind of been dealing, or 8 or 9 years that I've kind of been dealing with more significant symptoms.
So you struggle with this chronic illness, but you're also a biblical counselor and a licensed counselor. So you decide to write a book about it to help all of us. I have some chronic issues, but nothing like yours. But I found reading through your devotional I think it would be helpful for the target audience, you know, those who suffer with chronic illness, but also those who are around them, people who have any sort of chronic struggle. My more acute struggle is mental health, but I found that a lot of the book overlapped through that too. So I would say, like any chronic struggle, this book was great, and I really enjoyed it. It's I forgot to say this at the beginning, but it's a 30-day or 31-day devotional, and all about chronic illness and the lessons you learned. So
Mm-hmm.
in your book, you wrote this: as I begin to write this book, I asked myself a question. What is the number one message that people with chronic illness need to hear? What is the most important lesson that my own experience has taught me? In the end, I realized it was this: your relationship with God is vital for your survival. People will let you down. Symptoms will come and go. Life will be painful and filled with grief. God is your only certainty. So can you tell us a bit more about that, a bit more what drove you to write this book for everyone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think what you said about it being for anyone with chronic struggles is true. And it's that word chronic, that I think is really important, because what I found, even as I was in that place of struggling a lot with my health and not really knowing what to do, is that I would go and I would read books about suffering, and I would find them to be, many of them, very good,
Mhm.
but not completely satisfying, because a lot of them would assume that eventually your pain and your whatever you were going through, your suffering, was going to end. You know, there's a lot of talk about seasons of suffering and how you just have to, you know, wait and hold on and get through to the end of this season. And I found that mindset very discouraging, which is partly what led me to want to write a book specifically about chronic illness. But kind of going back to the quote that you read, I I I think I came to that being the number one lesson, partly because um, the other answers are just unsatisfying. You know, that answer of, you know, of relief, yes, you hope for that, but it's not a certainty. And yes, you hope that you're going to have great friends who are going to show up in your life. And I did many times, but I also had people who misunderstood me, or times when it was just difficult for me to reach out or even let people know that I needed help. You know, so there was lacking in relationships, and you know, that's not saying anything negative about the people in my life at that time. It was just kind of the reality of my struggle and where I was, that it just felt lacking. So many other things that felt lacking, and where there were not any answers. And so I had to go to that relationship with God, and that had to be the foundation. That had to be the certainty for me then, because there was no other certainty. So I think that's kind of how I came to that. And I think it's hopeful to think about it that way, because for me, it's not hopeful to say one day this is going to end when it might not. You know, so I kind of wanted to be honest and realistic with people about that in the book, and just in the way I talk to people. So yeah, that's what I would say about that.
That's awesome. Yeah. This is something a lot of people don't think about, that
It's
the
true.
pain doesn't, like in grief, pain fades even if it never goes completely away. A lot of suffering is just a season, but when you have that chronic component, it carries a whole nother level of discouragement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause it can even be, sometimes it's progressive, like it actually gets worse over time,
Yeah.
not better over time. And those, like you said, it's definitely things that people aren't really thinking about. I actually find that if I don't talk about my chronic illness for a while, some people start to think that I'm better, which is really interesting to me. They're like, oh, you haven't talked about it for a while. So like, I thought you weren't struggling. But it really is like an ongoing thing, even if I'm not talking about it, which I think is just a good thing for us to recognize, just in the various struggles that people around us are facing, to like know that sometimes it's ongoing, and just because they're not talking about it doesn't mean it's not still there.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm going to read another quote from here. Too often we equate faithfulness in suffering with silence. This goes well with what you were saying. But what if faithfulness in suffering happens through conversation? What if faithfulness in suffering happens through speaking our hurts aloud to God and to trustworthy people, just as David does in the psalm? Don't underestimate the power of speaking your suffering out loud. I first shared the story of my chronic health problems through my writing, and it's hard to explain the level of emotional healing and relief I felt the first time I told the truth about my pain and heard other people say, "Me too." Telling my story to God and to other people is how I have grieved my losses, processed my situation, and determined my next steps forward. I loved this quote because I so agree with this and what you're saying here. And that's why I love to have different perspectives on the podcast so that we can understand what other people are going through. And this season, especially, we're talking about one anothering well. And if we don't have these kinds of conversations, then people don't know how to one another well. So, what is something we can do to encourage this type of conversation with our friends who have chronic illness, or if we are the one experiencing chronic illness, how do we encourage these types of conversations?
hmm Yeah, it's a really good question, because these conversations tend to be very difficult for people with chronic illness to have. I mean, and not just people with chronic illness, different types of suffering as well. And, the themes that I find is that it's difficult because there's just so much past hurt. Those conversations maybe have not gone well in the past, because there's been a lot of misunderstanding of, when you're trying to explain what you're going through, there's often just a lot of inability to understand what you're trying to say. And even at times, just disbelief, like it can't actually be like that, or it can't be that bad, or just confusion because, you seemed fine yesterday, but now you're not okay. And like just kind of the ups and downs of symptoms, like some of those things are very difficult to explain. And it can be very exhausting because of that, but also exhausting because you're suffering in general. And I think that's what I experienced a lot of in some of my very difficult seasons of pain, when we had just moved to Baltimore. So I didn't know anybody. So I was trying to make friends when I was in this state. And I found that I was just so exhausted that it wouldn't have mattered if someone had responded perfectly. I still felt almost too exhausted to try to have some of those conversations. So I think, okay, that's the problem. So then what do we do about it? Um, I think probably the biggest part of getting past that past hurt and that fear of being misunderstood, I have just a couple thoughts on that. I think that one is that sometimes those conversations might actually happen with a counselor first. So if you're just in this place where you're just not ready to have that conversation with a friend, almost practicing that conversation with a counselor to kind of get over that hump.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that there is a lot of validity. I'm trying to think if that's the right way to say it. I think it's important to choose who you tell wisely. You don't have to tell everyone. There doesn't need to be this like everybody knows, or like even like you're sharing personally with, 5 different people. It could just be one person, and you could just be very, very careful about who you decide to share with. Um, and I think that it really comes down to believing that it's going to be worth it, that it is possible to have those conversations and to have friendships where, there's understanding both ways. It's possible and it's worth it. And yes, it's going to take work and it's going to be exhausting, but it really, really is worth it. And I think believing that is probably maybe one of the humps that we have to get over to start having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's so vulnerable.
Mm.
Trying to start this. So moving along kind of that same vein, you say in your book, it's so easy to forget that we are on the same side. We do not fight against flesh and blood. Chronic illness is not our biggest problem, and the people who misunderstand us are not our enemies. Scripture does not deny that problematic people exist, but too often these relational struggles and misunderstandings distract us from the spiritual battle that wages around us. Your true battle is against rulers, authorities, cosmic powers over this present darkness, and spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. Constantly feeling offended by people who misunderstand our illness doesn't win spiritual battles. In fact, it does the opposite. It pits us against one another when something much bigger is at stake. And this is so hard when we're trying to bring someone into our world and they don't understand it. I would imagine with something like lupus, it's not always visible either,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that can make it really hard too. And I know with like mental illness, sometimes people think, well, as long as you're smiling, you're fine, And
Mm-hmm.
so it's hard when things aren't visible, like you're not in a wheelchair or you're not confined to a bed for people to understand those kind of things. So a lot of conflicts can happen or misunderstandings. So this was my question with that. So you're talking in this book to people who have chronic illness and telling them to, to work through that hurt. But how can we, those who do not have chronic illness, how can we avoid being that type of friend? Like, what would you say to the friend of the person struggling?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate you asking this question because I did, write this devotional to people with chronic illness. So I did need to address them directly. But as I'm writing about this, I'm like, there is this other side of me as someone who has a chronic illness who just feels this like, but they have a responsibility too. Like, I feel that. And a lot of people with chronic illness feel that. And it's really something that I find like in the chronic illness circles that I kind of, am involved in online. It's really this tendency that we have to fight against, to not be constantly feeling offended and to not feel constantly bitter. But at the same time, there's a reason we feel that way to some extent. Like there really is a reason, because there just are a lot of difficult things that people say, and it often does not come from a bad place. It just comes from a place of not knowing what to say. So I say all that to say I appreciate the question, and people with chronic illness appreciate the question. And that could honestly even be a good place to start. Just if you're having a conversation with someone who has chronic illness, to ask that question of, I'm just curious, like, have I ever said something that was like difficult to you or made you feel misunderstood, or, that you had trouble with, like, even if you, just let it go. Was there anything that I should know about? It could be a good place to start. And maybe even more than that, I would just say that I think the best thing you can do is just listen, and to listen instead of offering advice. That's a really big thing with people who have chronic illness, is that we get a lot of advice about what we should or what we shouldn't do. And it makes us feel like our illness is somehow our fault, is kind of the impression that we start to get sometimes. So I really just, and this is something that, we all need in all of our friendships and relationships, regardless of what we're going through, is just listening and offering our presence. Because I think a lot of the misunderstandings that happen, they come out of not taking time to understand our experience and making assumptions. I would say those are probably the two key things where that's where these kind of offenses come from. So I think, taking the time to, like, if you have a friend with chronic illness, do you know what their diagnosis is? Have you ever asked them? And if you do you know anything about it? Like, have you ever Googled it? So taking the time to understand, and then the second of just not making assumptions, like, a big assumption that I think a lot of people are understanding better now is it must be so nice to stay at home. Like, we get that so much. It must be like a vacation. You get to watch Netflix all day. And like, suddenly we feel vindicated. We're like, see, it's not awesome. It's not great. So assumptions like that, I think, are, just another thing to watch for. So yeah, just listening, offering presence. Like, I think that's a really good place to start.
That's one observation I've made as I've been going through this Bible study, looking at all the one another verses in the Bible, and it's just so often it's just presence.
Mm-hmm.
And when that presence is there, the minor offenses are so much more easily forgivable, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, because if your friend loves you and is there for you and is trying to understand you, and they say one comment that is off, then it's more forgivable.
Absolutely.
So what would you say, is there anything else that you'd say we should pursue with our friends who have chronic illness? Like, what are some ways we could be trying to come actively into their lives without pushing somewhere we shouldn't be? But is there anything else that you would say, we want to offer our presence and we want to avoid some of these other things, but is there anything else that we should pursue with them?
I guess I would say that practical help can go a really long way. Offering practical help is a big thing because, a lot of people with chronic illness have a lot of needs, and they may not, voice those readily. They may not be specifically asking. So kind of maybe assessing those needs and seeing if you can meet them, that would definitely mean a lot to somebody. But it really, for me, it just comes down to just those regular friendship skills of just like kind of what we were saying before. I really think that that's the biggest thing that I would keep coming back to.
So in the book, you mentioned that it can be hard for those with chronic illness to find community.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some specific creative ways you can give us to cultivate that community? Maybe from both sides, from the perspective of the sufferer and the friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe I'm trying to think, I'll start with people who don't have chronic illness. I would say a big thing is to just keep inviting us, even if we say no, because that will happen a lot. Invite us, but don't pressure us, because there can be a lot of feelings of guilt on our side if we feel like we're really needed or wanted somewhere, and we just feel like we physically cannot. But we want to be invited. We want to be remembered. We want to be wanted there, but we don't want to feel pressured that if we don't make it, everybody will be so upset at us.
Mm-hmm.
So, to be a great friend to us would be to continue inviting us, even when we say no, but to never make us feel bad when we can't come. So I think that's one very big thing. And it really depends on, everybody's illness is different. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
So it really depends on, the type of limitations or barriers that someone is facing. Like, for someone, a creative thing might be that you go to them. Someone else might be like, no, don't come to me, so it really depends. Right. For somebody else, it might be like, for somebody who has an illness that prevents them from like eating in the same way as everybody else, something creative might be that you don't have food at every single event. Like, you center your events around something else, or that they can't have this whatever, and so you make them something specifically that doesn't have gluten in it or whatever that they can't have. Knowing that about them would be really meaningful to them. So because it's different for everybody, it does go back to that honest communication of, really just asking and knowing each other well, and trying to figure out what their needs are. But I guess kind of maybe the common theme would be just accommodations. So that if you have a friend with chronic illness in your life and they ask for an accommodation, whatever that might be, can you help me? Can you drive me to the event because I can't myself? Or can you drop me off at the door because I can't walk that far? Or, this sounds simple, but I have actually been surprised by the stories I hear of people asking for accommodations and not getting them. It's very interesting. And sometimes I don't know if it's because we're not communicating clearly, or where exactly these stories come from, but I hear them a lot. And it surprises me. It really does. It really surprises me of, people asking even churches for accommodations that seem very reasonable to me. And then for whatever reason, it's just not happening. So I think that's a big thing. I think on the side of people with chronic illness, we need to ask. We need to ask for what we need. Like, people cannot read our minds. And it's easy to become upset, oh, they didn't do this for me, or they didn't make this accessible to me. But then it's you have to come back to did they know you needed that? Did you ask? And I honestly think we don't ask for a couple reasons. One, because we're scared to hear no, that's devastating, to ask for an accommodation and not receive it. I think sometimes we feel ashamed about the accommodations that we need. And sometimes there is this feeling of, I'm not worth accommodating. I don't want to inconvenience people. But I think that a lot of people, we need to come to a place where we start to believe that no, we are worth accommodating, and it is okay to ask people to inconvenience themselves even so that we can be a part, because that's what it means to be in a community and carry each other's burdens. They're carrying our burdens and we're going to carry their burdens in some other way. But it's okay to ask for those things. So that general theme of accommodations is really important, I think, for on both sides to kind of figure that out.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you have any last thoughts before we kind of wrap up on how to one another well, those in our lives with chronic illness?
Yeah, I think the last thing that I would say is that we really just want normal friendships, anything that would be true about any friendship was going to be true about a friendship with someone who has chronic illness. And most of the time, we don't want our illnesses to be the central part of our friendships. We don't want that to be what we're always talking about. Yes, it's going to affect them, and yes, it's going to be always there underneath the surface. And yes, we want a place to talk about them, and we want to be understood, but we really don't want that to be, the central part of the friendship, or something that, for a lot of people, even something that is going to come up every time you meet. We just want friends, just like everybody else. So I think that's kind of a final thought on that.
Your illness is not your full identity.
Right.
That. Yeah, that's awesome. Esther, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really great, and I think beneficial to both those who are suffering with chronic illness and those of us who have people like that in our lives. Tell us a little bit more about your book, where we can find it. It's part of a series, so tell us a bit about that, and where people can find you online too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the book is part of a series called 31-Day Devotionals for Life. And each book is written by a biblical counselor or a Bible teacher on different topics that are just very practical. So there's one on doubts, there's one on anxiety, one on grief. There's just all sorts of very practical topics. And I've probably read about 4 or 5 of the other ones, and they're all excellent. So definitely just kind of, if you kind of Google on Amazon, Amazon's probably the best place to find them. You'll see all these different topics, and definitely, grab any that seem to fit into, where you are in life. In terms of mine specifically, it's called Chronic Illness, Walking by Faith. I kind of have that theme of just the unseen throughout it. Our illnesses are invisible, and so is, what God is often doing in our lives. And so that theme kind of runs throughout it. But yes, you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on a Westminster bookstore. I feel like there's a couple other places, but they're they're escaping me right now.
Those are pretty major ones, so you're okay there.
Yeah.
Um,
So.
yeah, it's a great series full of really practical stuff and really readable. Like it's just your book. I found it had deep thoughts, but in a easily digestible package. Like with the 31-day devotionals. It was excellent. And it has a verse in each one, and then talking about something to think about for the day. And it's split into 3 sections, right? 3 kind of themes.
Is it 3 or 4? I think there's 4.
You would know better than me, so
Yeah.
okay.
I'm like, I try to remember. I wrote it a while ago, but I think there's 4.
Okay. So it has these sort of themes that go throughout, and then you can dive deeper into each one as you go through the several days in each theme. So, and where can people follow you in your writing?
Yeah, so I have a blog. It's called lifeinslowmotionblog.com, where I write specifically for people with chronic illness. And I'm also on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. So yeah, all of those places are, I share on there pretty regularly about my writing and what I'm up to.
Awesome. And you're Esther Smith on the socials?
I'm not Esther Smith, because Smith is such a common name that it is so terrible to try to find any. Yes. So I
we'll
believe
link it.
It
we'll
is.
Link it.
Yeah.
I'll put it in the notes. But
okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so that's great. You'll want to follow Esther if you're listening or watching, and be encouraged there. You also have 2 other self-published books on Amazon too. So look up Esther Smith on Amazon. I just typed in Esther Smith and those 3 books came up. So
that's encouraging.
Yeah, so Esther Smith may be a common name, but maybe not amongst authors. So you're safe that way.
Oh, good.
So thank you so much for being here with us today, Esther, and teaching us a few things.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciated it, and just appreciated your thoughtful questions.